Our first speaker, who will be Mr. Jitu Thaker. He's from ICAO, and he will talk to us about uniting aviation, ICAO and access to air transport.
Thank you. Good afternoon, folks. Well, my name is Jitu Thaker, and can you hear? Okay. Oh, that works. Yeah. I'm a technical officer in facilitation in ICAO. ICAO, of course, as you may know, was formed by the Convention on International Civil Aviation that was signed in Chicago in 1944. It's an international treaty to which all countries are bound, and we have 191 member states. Now, I'm the manager of Annex 9 facilitation that deals with immigration, customs, health, and quarantine regulations. We have 19 annexes in the Chicago Convention, and Annex 9 is just one of them. Contained in the annex are standards, international standards, and recommended practices dealing with these topics. I've underlined standards because it's important. All states are bound by the standards in the annex. So if there's a standard, and unless a state informs us that it cannot comply, it is considered binding on that state. Forgive me my voice. I'm just recovering from a cold, and I've just discovered I have a nosebleed, so that happens all the time. So what I'm going to talk about is give you a background on when and why ICAO got involved in the issue of access to air transport for persons with disabilities. In the UN system, we use the word persons with disabilities. In other parts of the world, they use persons with reduced mobility, but that is the distinction between the two systems. And then I'll talk to you about Annex 9 and persons with disabilities, and go briefly over a manual, guidance material that we have developed to help users implement the standards and recommended practices on PWDs. So our work on this goes back a very, very long way. 1969, we included a provision in Annex 9 that permitted direct aircraft-to-aircraft transfer of invalid passengers in transit. Now, this was introduced for two reasons. One was to allow them to make connecting flights in case of tight deadlines, and secondly, to avoid lengthy travel in terminals. In 1990, this was expanded to include elderly and disabled passengers. Post-1969, there was a great upsurge in the travel of persons with disabilities internationally. And of course, there were many barriers for limiting such air travel. So ICAO decided to analyze the situation and to see what more could be done to enhance the facilitation of elderly and disabled persons. In 1986, the ICAO Assembly, assembly is a gathering of all our member states. The ICAO Assembly requested the ICAO Council. The ICAO Council is elected by the Assembly. It's made up of a group of states, and the ICAO Council is that group of states that manages the business of ICAO on a daily basis. It's like a cabinet. You have the parliament, and then you have the cabinet. So the Assembly requested the Council to review problems faced by elderly and disabled passengers And the council decided that this review would take place over, there were two parts would be examined. One was access to airports, and the second, broader aspect of access to air transport services. In 1990, new standards and recommended practices, that's SARPs, that's the short form we use, new SARPs on Annex 9 on access to airports was included in the annex, and supplementary guidance material was developed. The second part of the review took some time. That related to use of air services, and the different topics included was accessibility to aircraft by persons with disabilities, the movement of PWDs and on-board aircraft and the facilities and services available on board, contact with travel agents, the issue of fares, reduced fares, need for assistance, and the fares to be charged for such assistance. So in 1997, substantial additions were made to Annex 9. The term persons with disabilities was defined, and I will get to that in the next slide. Two standards. Now, remember I said standards are binding on all countries. Two standards, one on access to airports, one on access to air services by persons with disabilities were included in the annex to oblige states to ensure that airports were adapted to the needs of persons with disabilities, and that such persons had adequate access to air services. Of course, there were several recommended practices that dealt broadly with the subject matter, and guidance material was developed to assist users, especially states, to implement the standards and recommended practices. So in the annex, we tell the states what to do, and the guidance material tells them how to do it. So guidance material is, of course, it's guidance, just recommendations on what states could do, and leaving it up to them to implement some or all of the provisions depending on the capabilities. So person with disability is any person whose mobility is reduced due to a physical incapacity, sensory or locomotor, age, any other cause of disability when using transport, and whose situation needs special attention and the adaptation to the person's needs of the services made available to all passengers. Now this definition is word for word that is used in Europe for persons with reduced mobility. So ICAO adopted the definition that was being used in Europe. So basically, it's persons with reduced mobility and persons with disabilities are seen as more or less the same. Now, currently in Chapter 8 of Annex 9, the standards and recommended practices are divided into three sections: general provisions, access to airports, access to air services. So what do the general provisions provide for? They basically define the scope of the assistance that should be provided to persons with disabilities, ranging across all the elements of the journey, starting from the time the person decides to make a booking and concluding when the person with disability leaves the airport. So generally what these general provisions call for, the persons with disabilities should benefit from services available to the general public. There is no distinction made between the PWD and the person with disability. Information on assistance to be provided in accessible formats. Airports travel agencies should provide information that a blind person can access or a deaf person can access on all the assistance that can be provided at airports. The recommended practice in this section recommends that trained personnel should be available to assist persons with disabilities. So airports and airlines are recommended to set in place training programs to help persons with disabilities. Access to airports. There is a standard, as I said earlier, that states are required, they are obliged to ensure that airport facilities and services are adapted to the needs of persons with disabilities. There are several recommended practices. I will not give you all examples, just picking up selected examples. It is recommended that designated pickup and drop-off points located near main entrances and exits should be established. Ground transportation or special transport services should be provided where access to public transport is limited. And another recommended practice says that parking facilities should be provided near terminals, and assistance should be provided so that persons with disabilities can move from the parking spaces to the terminals. Access to air services is very broad. There are lots of recommended practices in this section. Of course, the standards requires that equivalent access to air services shall be provided to all persons with disabilities. A key point where we recently revised these provisions, a key point deals with the new and refurbished aircraft, that they should conform to accessibility standards. You know, movable armrests, the provision of wheelchairs, washrooms, accessible washrooms. And I will not say anything more about this because the three presenters after me are going to talk about this. But it tells you how important this topic is and how controversial it can get. Disability aids should be carried free of charge in the cabin, or if they are too big, for example, electric wheelchairs, then they should be carried as priority baggage. Service animals. For those of you who were here this morning, the issue of service animals came up. And this also is a controversial topic, but there was a lot of discussion on service animals. But basically, it was agreed that yes, they should be carried free of charge in the cabin at the seat of the person. And then finally, the need for an assistance by the persons with disability, and of the provision goes on to fare discounts, etc. Document 944 is the manual on access to air transport by persons with disabilities. It was published very recently, and I will not go into this in detail. I've just set out here the titles of the different chapters, and you will see they progress in chronological order. Of course, first you have the general issues, and then they talk about training to personnel at airports and airlines, and then starting off with the pre-journey, before the person begins the journey, moving on to arrival and moving through an airport. Airport facilities to be provided, security screenings and border checks, boarding and disembarking an aircraft, aircraft operators' services on board flights, accessible features on aircraft. What are these features? What should they be? And then connections and leaving an airport, ground transportation, finally ending with guidance material and complaints. If a person with disability has a complaint, what an airline should do, what the airport operator should do. And finally, The guidelines recommend that states should set up a monitoring and enforcement of compliance system, whereby they can ensure that these provisions are being complied at airports and by airlines. Last year we had our 38th assembly. The assembly recalled the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities and urged states to give due regard to document 9984 when implementing the provisions of Annex 9. And that, Mr. Moderator, brings me to the end of my presentation. And if you have any questions, please never hesitate to contact me. That's my email address on the slide here. Thank you.
Any questions for ICAO?
I had
Yes.
no, I had provided copies of the manual to the organizers, and I think they were supposed to be, not everybody will get a copy, but they should be made available for people who are interested. So,
thank you. You've talked about Annex 9 being binding on states and that they are obliged to implement. But the reality is that many of them are not implementing, and I wondered what ICAO does to monitor and enforce the implementation of Annex 9.
yeah. No, it's just the standards that are binding.
But the standards are not being implemented.
That is, yes. Unfortunately, we have, by the way, we have an enforcement mechanism in ICAO where all the SOPs have what is known as a audit program. And we go to all countries and to ensure that these provisions are complied with. Annex 9 is the only annex that is not audited. The reason for this is because we deal with immigration, we deal with customs, we deal with health authorities, we deal with tourism authorities, disability authorities. And since ICAO is an aviation organization, it's difficult for us to go and audit other parts. There's some discussion going on, and hopefully sometime in the future we may start auditing these provisions, and at that point we certainly will get to these as well.